Welcome to Defense Priorities video series reviewing the newly released National Defense Strategy. I'm Jennifer Kavanagh, Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, and I'll be breaking down the NDS with leading defense and foreign policy experts. We'll discuss what it gets right, what it gets wrong, and what it means for restraint and U.S. grand strategy going forward. In this episode, I'm joined by George Beebe, the Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. We're going to be talking about the National Defense Strategy's focus on the Western Hemisphere. Thanks for joining us today, George.
Thank you for inviting me.
My first question for you is this shift to the Western Hemisphere that we see in the National Defense Strategy and that we also saw in the National Security Strategy has received a lot of attention, both praise and criticism. So what's your take? Is this the right focus for U.S. National strategy, especially the military strategy, to be emphasizing the Western Hemisphere?
Well, I fall into the praise category on this. I think it is definitely a shift. It should be getting attention, and it's something to be commended. It, I think, is a concrete example of the United States essentially recognizing something it should have recognized decades and decades ago, and that is that the entire world is not a sphere of our vital interests. Some parts of the world matter more than others. We can't do everything. We have limited resources. We have to prioritize what matters. And geography hasn't changed. Geography is still an important factor that we have to take into account in planning our defense posture and planning our national strategy. So this is something that our founding fathers would have considered completely uncontroversial. In fact, this was one of the principles that guided their approach to national security way back in the decades following the country's founding. And so I think it is to be commended. Now, I think reasonable people can debate how you go about asserting that prioritization. What concretely do you do? But the question is whether the Western Hemisphere, whether our immediate neighborhood should be the highest priority for American national security, I think should be entirely uncontroversial.
Well, that's an interesting point of view, and I agree with you directionally. This makes sense, certainly for those advocating a smaller military footprint in the world, or U.S. military footprint, having a greater focus on the defense of the homeland and the near abroad makes a lot more sense than wasting military resources in the Donbass or somewhere else far away. But can you tell us a little bit more about how the National Defense Strategy goes about this? What are the types of threats and challenges that it identifies as ones that the military should be taking on?
Well, I think some of this has to do with the kinds of things that can flow across our borders that can hurt Americans, their well-being, their prosperity, their security. And that really is a function of border security and ensuring that we have control over the flow of people, the flow of weapons, the flow of drugs, the flow of things that have a concrete effect on the well-being of Americans here inside the United States itself. Now, what the National Defense Strategy is saying is not only does the United States have to prioritize an ability to defend itself, to defend its borders against those things, we also need the help of countries in our neighborhood. We need them to take steps to minimize, if not eliminate, the flows of those bad things from their countries across our borders inside the United States. Now, how do you do that? That's another question. First of all, you have to convince them that we're really serious about this. This is not just some casual declaration on our part. We do regard this as something that has quite a concrete impact on American security and well-being. Now, the other part of this is what I might call strategic aspects of the Western Hemisphere. Things that affect America's military security, its ability to have a free flow of commerce. We've always been a trading nation. Access to the sea, for example, is critical to our ability to undertake trade and commerce. We need to make sure that we have a secure flow between the homeland and markets abroad. So that also goes to sea lines of communication. It goes to aerospace, and in particular the space side of things. And I think that's an underemphasized but important aspect of defense of the homeland. And this is where Greenland comes into play. And I count Greenland as part of the Western Hemisphere, as part of this defense of our immediate neighborhood that we're emphasizing. If you're going to defend space, Greenland is a great place to do that. In fact, there are probably no better places on the globe where the United States can put in place an ability to defend our satellite constellations, for example, as well as defending the homeland against long-range missile attacks, because its location, near the North Pole. And one aspect of this that people don't, I think, frequently understand is just how dependent Americans are on our satellite constellations. This is for commercial activities, not just for military activities. It's not just that we have this nice convenience of GPS guidance systems in our cars that we can use to go to places that we're unfamiliar with. We actually can't even conduct point of sale transactions. I can't go to the gas station and fill up my tank of gas using a credit card without using our satellite constellations. And they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable in ways that they never were back in the bad old Cold War days. Used to be that you put something up there in space and you could be pretty certain that it was not going to be shot out of the air in some way. That's not the case anymore. The satellite constellation is vulnerable to terrestrial-based attack and increasingly vulnerable to space-based attacks. So figuring out how to secure that is a critical part of Homeland Defense. And so this is an aspect that is a 21st century twist on the Monroe Doctrine that was so familiar to the first few generations of American leaders.
Mm-hmm. So, the original Monroe Doctrine was really about making sure that foreign influence wasn't continuing sort of imperialistic trends or colonial trends in the Western Hemisphere and asserting a U.S. sphere of influence. Is that really the case today? Do we need to be worried about foreign influence? Certainly probably not from Europe, but people point to Chinese or Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere. Is this something that the administration should be concerned about?
Well, I think so, yes. And I think it's not so much the ideological kind of influence that we were worried about in the early Monroe Doctrine period, when we were worried about autocratic states that were colonizing and establishing a presence, or had already established a presence in the Western Hemisphere that the United States found disturbing. Today, it's not as if the Chinese are going to be spreading, Chinese nationalism throughout Latin America. That's not an ideology that is easy to export. It's not like the Venezuelans are going to become Chinese nationalists. But I think the danger that we have is really more of a strategic danger. It's a situation where China could position itself in such a way that it could dominate or control things that are strategic to the United States that are in the Western Hemisphere. Strategic minerals, for example, are increasingly important to the functioning of a modern economy, of a modern military. The United States has a big problem there. That's a vulnerability. Access to the Panama Canal, the ability to get strategic minerals in our own hemisphere, to have access to those. If the Chinese basically control the mines where this stuff is mined and have a near monopoly on the processing of these minerals, that's a problem for the United States economically and militarily. So we do have to pay attention to this. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the threat there. This is not an urgent, the United States is about to face a mortal threat to its existence kind of problem, but it is also a problem that we can't afford to be complacent about. We can't just believe that everything is going to work out. We don't have to care about what the Chinese are doing in our neighborhood. I think we have ignored this to our detriment. And addressing this is a serious matter that we have to take seriously.
So these things that you're talking about, whether it's securing access to critical minerals or preventing drug flows across the U.S. border or immigration, are these military tasks, though? Are these things that our U.S. military is really trained to do? Or are these more law enforcement tasks that should fall to the Coast Guard or Border Patrol, or economic tasks where we should be focused on getting more public and private investment into places in the Western Hemisphere? Do we need the military to accomplish these goals?
Well, in my experience in government, diplomacy was always more effective when there was the potential for the use of coercive force behind it. That always put an exclamation point behind the requests that we were making of other countries. It focuses their minds. Now, the question really here is one of balance. Do you look at these problems as problems that you can solve exclusively through military means? And my answer to that is no. That is not the way to do this. Do you look at this as something that you approach exclusively by talking, sitting down and saying, hey, can't we just find a way forward here? I think the reality of the way the world works is that seldom do you reach satisfactory agreements simply by asking another country to please respect what you're asking them to do. Usually it has to be a combination of leverage and engagement. Now, reasonable people can disagree on how you strike that balance. And I think there is a danger that if we rely too much on coercion, that we could subvert our own objectives in all of this and create a backlash that makes states less inclined to cooperate with us, more inclined to seek outside relationships with other powers to counterbalance the United States. This was the problem that the Russians have run into perpetually in dealing with their near abroad, where too heavy-handed an approach actually drove demand in Russia's neighborhood to join NATO to seek the protection of the United States. My guess is that when it comes to Latin America, the United States is going to be less prone to that kind of problem, simply because there isn't the equivalent of the United States out there that can come in and has the kind of military power far from its borders to really counterbalance the United States military power in our own neighborhood. So I think we have a little bit more room for maneuver, but we still have to pay attention to this tipping point where too heavy-handed an approach to leverage actually subverts our ability to achieve the kind of goals that we want to achieve.
I think those are great points. My last question, taking a step back, overall, as I'm someone who'd like to see a smaller U.S. military footprint in the world. I think you agree with me to some extent. Should we feel good about this national defense strategy? Does it move our U.S. defense policy in the right direction, in your view, or the wrong direction?
Well, I think it absolutely moves in the right direction. This is a prioritization document. It's saying, we have tried to do too much. We're overextended. We can't, in every region of the world, be the security guarantor for this network of alliances that we've created over the past many decades. Our allies are going to have to step up. We can provide support to them in areas where they are lacking and where we've got some really irreplaceable capabilities. And that goes for Europe, where the Europeans are going to have to play a much bigger role in their own self-defense with continued U.S. help, but they'll bear the bulk of that burden. I think the NDS says the same thing about South Korea. I think it's also leaning that same direction in the Middle East. And I think what that means is we're going to have a drawdown in those areas. How you manage that, how quickly it goes, that's another question. But I think that's the direction we're heading in. And we're focusing really on the most critically important parts of the world for us. And the NDS defines this first as our homeland, the immediate neighborhood, and second is the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's about right. That's where those priorities ought to lie. And one of the things about the Western Hemisphere is we don't need a network of foreign bases in order to project power into our immediate neighborhood. We can do that from the homeland. So it is actually a less expensive and more secure approach to our national defense than what we've been doing for the past many decades.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, George. These have been really great insights. Really appreciate you joining us today. For everyone else, make sure to tune into the other videos in this series.